and I'm not normally into historical, but I thoroughly enjoyed that book. It was such a smooth, easy read, and
Oh,
it just,
good.
and when you mentioned about him asking if he, you know, did I mention I was afraid too many times?
Yeah.
He rarely mentions it at all.
Yeah, well, really, I mean, it was,
You know,
of
other
course
than
they
his
would.
actions, of course, you know he's afraid, but he
Yeah.
doesn't talk about it much.
Yeah, there would be something wrong with him if he wasn't afraid,
Yeah.
you know, given what happened, yes.
How was George chosen? Did you choose him, or were you looking for someone to do a memoir of, or how was that?
No, I am a writer. My book was fairly well known on Vancouver Island where we were living. I was teaching writing workshops, and I taught some workshops with a woman named Sheila Monroe, who wrote a book about growing up with Alice, her mother. And so we were doing this. So my name was in the paper a fair amount. And Paula tracked me down, phoned me up, and like I say, they were pretty, well, I don't know about this, you know, but they decided maybe I was okay after a while, but they found me, really, basically.
They came to you, but then they were still hesitant about what you were going to do.
Yeah, well, I think there's a big trust issue there. I mean, who, you know what I mean, like who, I'm not, I mean, am I gonna, you know, say, oh, this is, especially when he was kind of insecure about his writing, you know, when I'd say, oh, you know what I mean? I don't know if anybody's ever sent anything off to a publisher and, you know, you get a form letter back if you're lucky. You know, it was that was a big brave step to actually reach out and have somebody else look at your writing when, you know, you're painfully aware that you don't have, you know, very good grammar skills or anything like that. So that was really, I think, a great thing as well. Any other questions?
Did he have children?
No, they never had children, and I'm not sure. I mean, it may have even been some of his experiences, his war experience. You know, he was in these salt mines and saltpeter rooms and things. I don't know if that affected him or not, but no, they didn't. So.
Were they they were actually inhaling that same,
Yes.
yeah, which is very,
Yes. Yeah, and he talks a lot about that in the book. He so you know, it's because it is a war story. I mean, there's, like he says, no shortage of excitement that's in here. But at times it's really sad. But also, you know, you can see in the film he really had quite the sense of humor. And there's things in the book, funny stories. Well, you know, they're kind of funny stories, but also, like if it was me, like I say, I left this as he wrote it. And I'll read you a little bit here. Like I would have had, I think, more questions than he had here. So this is when they're in Sicily. Later, we were heading into a valley, and we passed through a small town I will always remember. The upper stories of the houses on our left side were full of young women. It was astonishing to see so many good-looking young women in one village in Italy. There were about 25 or 30 well-dressed and very, I mean very, attractive girls in their late teens and early 20s waving to us. Now this town didn't even seem large enough to have a house that big. We later figured it must have been an R&R camp for Jerry. Everyone else lined up along the side of the road. The elderly ladies kissed our hands and gave us bread and eggs. I read later it was a sign of friendliness to offer an egg to someone. When we reached the other end of town, we each had a helmet full of eggs and a loaf of bread stuck in our bayonet. After the war, Lieutenant Gray said that when he passed the girls, he was afraid to look back in case he didn't have a platoon any longer. On the way back, one of the scouts explained how to suck an egg by poking a hole in each end. I gagged a bit, but it went down. We were hungry, or I wouldn't have tried it. We also cracked an egg on a helmet and cooked it. It was that hot. When we reached the valley floor, Brigadier Hofmeister caught up to us in the Jeep. He called Lieutenant Gray over for a conference. Lieutenant Gray came back smiling. He said, Hoffy suggested we stop and cook up some of the eggs and eat the bread so that we look more like an army ready to fight. We didn't look too smart with helmets full of eggs and a loaf of bread stuck in the end of our bayonet. So we scrambled, boiled and fried eggs. We took some hard-boiled eggs for later. So, you know, that's kind of a funny story, but also, I mean, there's a whole thing, you know, with these women, you know, who were these women, you know, and how did they happen to get there, you know, were they now what they call sex slaves, you know, were they collaborators, what happened to them after, I mean, are the kind of questions, you know, I would be wondering about, you know, how did the other Italians treat them? So we have gone through the book, and I was doing my search. Anybody here speak Italian? No?
Ciao.
Oh, just ciao, okay. George, you'll notice he was talking about Tedeschi, the evil ones, you know, and how he kind of looked at me and he said, I believe that means, you know, the evil ones. What does it mean?
It means Germans.
Germans, yes, exactly. So in the research that I was doing, you know, I found that out. And I said, because he has a kind of slang German he uses throughout here, he, I guess, what he picked up because of necessity. And I said, no, George, that means Germans. And he was, no way, you know, that meant the evil one. That was in his head, and probably, like he was saying, somebody was translating, and they probably had really limited, you know, English skills, and they were trying to explain the Germans, the evil ones, the Germans, get out of here. And so he got it in his head that means the evil ones, and there was no convincing him otherwise. And you can see in the film, he kind of looks at me, you know, that's, I believe that that's what that means.
So how did you handle that in the book?
I just put in what, you know, he said, you know, I can't remember exactly how he dealt with that, but there were other things in there. Some of the, like I say, Mark Zelke was one of the people who read the book, and he was doing some really serious research about that campaign. And he wrote back about, George had said there was a Tiger tank, you know, German tank, big German tank that had been developed during the war in this one town. And when Mark Zelke wrote back, he said, you know, no, that's not correct. It wouldn't have been a Tiger tank because they didn't come until, you know, later in that year or something. So in the little author's note, he wrote, well, I actually wrote the note for him, but based on what he was saying. I recorded these memories several years after the end of the war and reconstructed dialogue as accurately as possible. Although some names and details are hazy, I recall the events vividly, and I think that's probably a really fair thing. Like, he did remember sort of what happened, but you know, some of the things like that weren't quite necessarily. One of the things about George in the book that comes out more when you read the book than came out in that short film is he really had a decency and fairness about, you know, how he was dealing with the Germans. Like, he was very interested in these guys on the other side, and he was always saying things like, they probably don't want to be there either. They're probably really a lot like me, the young other soldiers. And the biggest problem that he has that comes up throughout the book was the British officers. You know, Canada was still under Britain. A lot of these guys, the generals and so on, were career soldiers with really, you know, long histories of traditions in their various regiments. And George was just incredibly lippy young kid, you know, when he's talking there, he's talking about Regimental Sergeant Major Lord, and I'll talk about him again either, but here's another situation that he has. This is when he's still in Buchenwald, and later on the brigadier called a parade. This guy still had his Batman and camp cot. They had their teeth, and perhaps he thought he should do something to show his authority. I gave him, I guess it gave him a feeling of power or importance. He stopped in front of me, tore a strip off me for not shaving and being very unsoldierly. I told him I didn't have a razor, that I was captured while I was fighting the enemy and scouting in the front line. I didn't carry my razor. Borrow one, he said. Under KR I can't do that, I said. Under what, he asked. King's Regulations, Canada, I replied. Then he gave me a dressing down for quoting King's rules and for insubordination. He would report me when we got to a registered POW camp. I said I would do the same.
No.
So, you know, he has this sort of attitude all throughout, you know, right from the beginning. You know, if he thought something wasn't right, you know, he wasn't going to go along with that. And when he was in this punishment camp, he was always being beaten by this one guy, and because he was always doing things, you know, like pulling the wires and trying to trip them up and stuff like that. You know, in his mind, they were at war, and he was going to do whatever he could to frustrate their efforts, and they had him pegged as a troublemaker. It's actually amazing he survived, that they didn't just take him out and shoot him, because it was pretty bad. So he talks about Regimental Sergeant Major Lord, and so he said a number of things about Regimental Sergeant Major Lord, and I said, oh, George, I don't think you can really, you know, say that about him. Like, you can't say things about people, you know, if you say things about people that aren't true, it's called slander.